leaf blowing right outside my little backyard office, excuse for an office. So I asked them to move, but they might come back because I don't know if the message was received. So if they do, I hope it's not too disruptive.
Oh, no, that's quite all right. That's quite all right. And I wanted to ask up front too, are you okay if we record this for other folks who aren't able to make it right now?
Sure.
But we could
Sure.
reference back. Okay, cool. I just wanted to make sure that was okay with you as well. We could not be more thrilled, Nicole, to have you join us in the Cybersecurity Book Club. We were praising and singing your accolades before you joined already. But if it's okay, we'll properly give you an introduction here. And then if you had any opening kind of thoughts or remarks, would love to hear more about your odyssey, right? Because this is nothing if not an odyssey in reporting and writing this.
I love that. I haven't even thought of the word odyssey, but I keep calling it, obviously part of it is a personal journey, and odyssey is a great, I'm going to borrow that.
Good. No, please
okay.
do. But no, so everyone, we're so thankful to you, Nicole, and we're honored to be joined by you in particular. Nicole Perlroth, obviously everybody, she covers cybersecurity, as you know, and digital espionage for the New York Times. She covered a wide range of cyber attacks over the years, from Russian hacks of nuclear power plants, airports, elections, North Korea's cyber attacks against Sony back in the day, banks, hospitals, basically you name it. her first book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, I certainly hope will not be her last book. But as you know, it's all about the global cyber arms race. Recently published just a few months ago, and has been optioned, which is great. Which great news. I just saw that for television. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about that as well when you get a chance, Nicole. Nicole herself is a guest lecturer at Stanford and a graduate of both Princeton and Stanford as well. So we're so thankful to have you join us today in this book club. And like I said, Nicole, if you're willing just to give some, opening thoughts about both what made you decide to take on this book length project on top of all of your other responsibilities. I don't know where you found the time, frankly, and any other insights you'd like to share in both the kind of reporting and writing of it. And then we certainly have plenty of questions that we'd like to get to as well. But of course, want to be respectful of your time. So thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me and for all the kind words there. So I, like you said, I've had this front row seat to every nation state attack and major attack over the last decade. I didn't really ask for this. I sort of stumbled into it, and now I'm steeped in it and can't get out. But I just wanted to ask the basic question of, why do things keep getting worse and not better? And from my position, I knew that Congress was unwilling to legislate rules around setting better cybersecurity standards. And I knew that anytime there was an attempt to craft a bill that mandated better cybersecurity for critical infrastructure operators, for example, they always got shot down or watered down. And so we were really left with a place where we were allowing the market to dictate just how secure we were. And so I just wanted to look at those incentives. So I'm based in Silicon Valley, and still the main operating MO out here is move fast and break things. And as we all know, speed is the natural enemy of security. But no one out here seems to really get that yet, unless you're a security startup or security startup venture capitalist. People are still talking about this, about virtualization, without mentioning security. Mark Andreessen mentioned software is eating the world, but he has made very little mention of cybersecurity over the years. And so the operating MO out here is just get your software, get your product to market, keep shipping. You can fix the glitches and the bugs later. And then from an individual standpoint, we just want what we want right now. Security is annoying. No one wants to be bothered with password requirements or two-factor authentication or updating the software on their phone or thinking twice before they have to click a link or an attachment. But the one incentive structure that really fascinated me was in government. We assume that we are spending our taxpayer dollars to help fund programs to keep us more secure in the cyber domain. But in reality, it's quite different. In reality, there are lots of incentives inside intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies to keep us more vulnerable. And that wasn't the case 3 decades ago when we were all using different technology. If we found a glaring hole in Huawei software, hardware, routers, or switches, we didn't really feel the need to go tell Huawei about it so they could patch it. We could use that to spy on Huawei's customers in North Korea, in Iran, in Sudan, and Syria, and places that relied on Huawei technology or Chinese technology. Whereas here, with very few exceptions, we weren't using Huawei's technology. But these days, thanks to globalization, we're all using the same technology. We're all using Android phones and iPhones and Microsoft Windows, whether you know it or not. And we're rolling all that software into our most critical systems. So when we hold on to a vulnerability for espionage and intelligence operations, we are necessarily leaving Americans more vulnerable. And that is, I knew, one thing that nobody wanted to talk about. I say in the book, it's sort of like Fight Club. The first rule of the zero-day market is no one wants to talk about the zero-day market. And the second rule is nobody talks about the zero-day market. So when no one wants to talk about something and you're a journalist, you can't help but want to go dig further and scratch at that one thing nobody wants to talk about. And that was the impetus for this book, was really to explore the incentive models and to see where they were leading. And in my opinion, and from my perch at the New York Times, none of them were leading us down a road of improved cybersecurity. They were all leading us to a place that I didn't think any of us wanted to be, and I didn't think many people understood the stakes involved. And so I wanted to sort of shake them out of their complacency in the same way my sources have shaken me of my complacency over the past decade.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much, Nicole. That's so helpful. And it's impossible to do justice, to this whole book. So we have to say that in advance to anybody who hasn't made it through the entire thing yet. But we have a number of questions where we're hoping to get some reflections on here and there. And we have several that our Associate Dean Espen Haklavardi has prepared in advance. So maybe we could turn to one of those first. If that's okay, Espen. And then there's certainly a number of others that we could turn to, but of course we want to give everybody the opportunity to chime in as well. But maybe over to you first, Espen, if that sounds okay.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Nicole, for being here. It's great talking to you and seeing you in person, virtually in person. So I wanted, if you could please talk a little, because you met James Gosler and you talk in the book, you really are full of praise for him, and his talent seems to be really extraordinary with the things that he did back then. But can you tell us more about your also personal experience talking to him and, having those conversations and his role as basically the father of cybersecurity?
Yes, I didn't know about Jim Gosler going into this book. When I signed up to do this book, I'd never heard of the name Jim Gosler. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to tell a human story about a very technical subject matter. And to do that, I decided I wanted to structure this book around people, but I wanted those people to represent various slices of this market. And so if as you read the book, you'll notice usually every chapter is about a different person that can speak to that slice of the market, whether it's the first zero-day broker or it's me, in my sort of eyes wide open, what is this thing, learning journey, or is it a foreign entity or whatever. But the thing that was most intimidating of all is, who am I going to get to speak to and represent the intelligence community's perspective on this? And it was incredibly intimidating to just think about how to handle that. And I really didn't know how to solve for it when I signed up to do this book. And I didn't even know how to solve for it, 2 years into researching and writing this book. But one day I was sitting at work and I was ruing about this and my anxiety about this particular aspect of writing this particular book. And my predecessor at the New York Times, John Markoff, walked by And he said, oh, why don't you just reach out to Jim Gosler, the father of cyber war? And I was like, what? Who is Jim Gosler? And how did I not know that there is a father of cyber war in the United States? And lo and behold, sorry, I just realized I don't have do not disturb on. Let me just do that very quickly. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. Amateur mistake. By the end of this pandemic, I will have figured out how to do these smooth Zoom meetings. But so I reached out to him. I Googled him. I'd never heard about him. I couldn't find much on the internet except for his retirement announcement in the sort of like local corporate Sandia newsletter. And I started asking around. Anytime I was at a conference or a dinner with someone like Michael Hayden, or Leon Panetta, or people who were senior in the hierarchy of our intelligence community or defense, I would ask them at the end of these conversations, if you had to name one person who is the godfather of American cyber war, who would that person be? And lo and behold, a lot of them said Jim Gosler. So I called him up one day. He is retired. He lives in Nevada outside Las Vegas, which I just found fascinating because he told me he'd never been to Black Hat or DEF CON and had very little interest in ever going. So the first time we met, I met him during the Black Hat conference I think we were at the Venetian maybe. And it was the first time he'd ever stepped foot anywhere near the conference, which blew my mind because in my eyes, he's sort of like the Wizard of Oz. But there's this giant annual cybersecurity hacking convention that happens every year, and he doesn't even bother going to it. In fact, he told me it's a terrible place to recruit. But when I called him, you wouldn't think this, but actually our interests were more aligned than you might think when you think about a journalist who's trying to dig into a market and a place that's largely classified, and someone who led many of these classified programs. But where he came out at the end of his career was he is very concerned about our critical infrastructure security. And he believes that we are in la la land, we the American people are in la la land. And he believes that our adversaries are acquiring the ability to take out the grid or take out other critical infrastructure, and that more adversaries are coming into the space, and that we are no more secure than we were when he started his career at Sandia looking for vulnerabilities in the parts that make up our nuclear weapon systems. So he had an incentive to get that message out, and he is an incredibly humble person. I joked with him, and I mentioned in the book that he looks like Santa Claus. He doesn't look like someone you would think was the godfather of cyber war, which is another thing that makes him sort of the Wizard of Oz in this space. And when I told him he resembled Santa Claus, he laughed and he said, some people might say Satan. But he is an incredibly humble guy. And every time I mentioned that people called him the godfather of cyber war, he would really just wince and say, it wasn't me. I was part of these teams of heroes that built up these programs, and no one will ever know their names. One of his good friends is, I hope I'm not butchering the name here, it's Tony Mendez, who is the hero of Argo. And one of the things we talked about in one of our conversations was the fact that there was that part, that thing at the end of the movie where Tony Mendez gets the award for everything he did getting during the Iran hostage crisis, and that he couldn't even bring his son to the award ceremony because the award ceremony was classified. Jim really, he identified with that. Most of his feats in this space are things he will never be able to talk about until he's dead, until these programs are declassified. And when you talk to people, a lot of people credit him with the fact that we went from a place from being so far behind Russia's capabilities during the Cold War, when we discovered their typewriter implants, to where we are today, which I think there is a large consensus that the United States is the top cyber superpower digital exploitation specialist in the world. You know, where I am at the times, I'm constantly covering Russian attacks and Chinese attacks and attacks out of Iran and cyber criminals. And rarely do I ever talk about the attack that was just discovered by the NSA. And that's not because I am avoiding covering the NSA, it's because we never get caught. The US intelligence community, and there is good reason for that. We are just more sophisticated and stealthy than our adversaries. But Jim knew, and I knew, that our adversaries were increasing their capabilities in a time frame that we had underestimated, and were able to do serious destruction to our most critical systems without the capabilities of the United States or Stuxnet. They could wipe out Saudi Aramco's data with rudimentary wiping code, and they could decimate 70% of Sony's servers because they were upset about a movie and take aim at our free speech. And we never anticipated that those things would happen as quickly as they have. So, you know, when he spoke to me, we were very much aligned on that. And there were a lot of things he couldn't talk about, obviously, and he never discussed any classified information with me. And I hope I make that clear in the book. So I had to work around him. And I also had to work around his humble ego because he didn't want to take credit for any of this. And so, you know, you have to, when that happens as a journalist, you really have to go talk to everyone around that person to get their perspective. And most people's perspective was that he really is the godfather of American cyber war, and that we have him to thank for the fact that we are not woefully behind in this space. But many of the things that he did that would justify that reputation didn't make it into the book, and we might never know for 2 decades.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that he was, I understand that, and reading your book, I got the impression that he was perhaps critical of lack of importance that we give here to defensive operations, and we are emphasizing the offense more. I know that to people, even to students, even anytime that you have a course on cybersecurity and you emphasize offense over defense, you have many more students and many more people are excited by going and doing pen testing as opposed to defending against pen testing. And infrastructure in particular, there are much fewer places who teach even how to defend ICS SCADA type systems as opposed to network security.
Hacking them.
So does he see the same thing? What is the solution he sees? Like, what do we do there?
Yeah, he does. It's so interesting. I hadn't thought about that in academia too. I've seen that play out in so many different ways, from stories about recruiting to defense at the Department of Homeland Security. And we have these scholarships in place where, we will pay people's college tuition if they agree to a few years of service. And when you talk to people like Alan at SANS, Alan Pollard, what he says is, when you look at the numbers, everyone wants to go work at the NSA, or maybe these days Cyber Command. Nobody wants to go work at the Department of Homeland Security or work as a system and admin for the Pentagon. It has always been more fun to be a pirate than be in the Coast Guard. And that is especially true in this domain. And I think that is Jim's perspective as well. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he came to offense by calling out the fact that if we continue to introduce complex microchips into the parts that make up our nuclear weapon systems, that we could never be confident that they were not riddled with backdoors. That is really his thesis. And he sought to demonstrate that at Sandia. He sought to demonstrate that to the NSA when he was invited to go there to demonstrate the training exercise he'd come up with at Sandia. He, continues to believe that today. And, I think the solutions are so complex that we never even really got to them in our conversation because the level of awareness was so lacking that really it was just about how do we get greater awareness to the digital vulnerability of our critical infrastructure, and how do we make people wake up to what an attack on those systems would look like, and Since the book has come out, other people have spoken up to me about their experiences with Jim, and they call him sort of a doomsdayer. But of course he's a doomsdayer. You know, he's been so embedded in these programs. He has seen how vulnerable they are. He's seen how vulnerable you can make these systems at scale. And he knows that we cannot trust our basic security. And that is what he has dedicated his life to. So he was part of the Defense Science Board task force that came up with certain recommendations for critical infrastructure security, and it's worth everyone going and reading that report. But you know, at the end of the day, it's not that sophisticated. The recommendations are: get a handle on just how vulnerable you are, make sure you have basic security protocols in place, make sure you have multi-factor authentication and updated software and visibility into your network, and what data employees are moving to the cloud, and that you have air gapped your most critical systems. You know, these are not new solutions. These are just things that have been out there for a long, long time, but for whatever reason, we are not implementing them.
Good. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Espen. Fantastic. And just as a quick reminder, the queue is open, but we have plenty of questions for Nicole, but we want to make sure to hear from everybody else too. So again, feel free to use the raise the hand or the chat function, whatever you're most convenient with or familiar with. Well, one thing you just kind of referenced, I want to get more into the substance for sure as well, Nicole, but one kind of observation you referenced, you know, off and on throughout the book is the fact that, well, you know, not to put you fine a point on it, but cybersecurity is not known as a field for its diversity. Right. And it was pretty common, for example, I think you make this point that you were one of the only woman in a lot of these rooms, in a lot of these, you know, hallways, having some of these discussions. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on, you know, what that experience was like. Was that a hindrance, you know, more times, frankly, than it was an asset? Was it a bit of both? And, you know, of course, we need to have a bigger discussion about how we change that. But I would love to hear your experience about what that meant and how that kind of played into your reporting here.
Well, I think, you know, anytime you're a journalist covering an industry, any industry, you are an outsider, you know, and it's hard. I remember in journalism school asking my professors who would come in, these adjunct professors who worked at the New York Times during the day and would come teach for an hour a week. The question I always want to know is, how do you handle that? How do you handle being this outsider and being a friendly person who is curious without being friends? You know, that just seems so awkward. How do you manage that? And in cybersecurity, couldn't be more of an outsider. You know, I am not male. I am not technical. I do not have an engineering or coding background. I ask dumb questions all the time. I have to ask dumb questions because my readers have questions and I won't be able to answer them unless I'm able to answer the basics. And that can be tedious for a lot of people. But also, this community in particular is hypercritical. You know, if you are on Twitter and you follow people in information security, you've probably picked that up. They are hypercritical for good reason. Sometimes they treat these issues as religious ones. There is very little tolerance for error or FUD, you know, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. There is very little tolerance for incompetence. And that makes it even more difficult to come in as an outsider who is asking basic questions. But also, you know, for the topic of my book, you almost had to be an outsider because so many people in this space have taken for granted the fact that there are vulnerabilities in everything, that there is now a market for vulnerabilities. For whatever reason, we have just assumed that's normal. And as an outsider coming in, that was not normal. The fact, I just kept coming back to it, like, what? We, the American taxpayer, are funding programs that stockpile vulnerabilities in the software we use so that we can spy on our enemies. But that means that we can't tell Apple and Microsoft about it, and we're left more vulnerable. Like, why isn't anyone talking about this? This seems like there is a big moral hazard here. And it seems like there are a lot of perverse incentives baked into that. And what do these programs look like? And why aren't more people asking about this? And why can't they talk about it? And why aren't they saying who their customers are? And if they're not talking about their customers, then who can't they sell these to? Can they not sell these to Iran or China or Russia? Or what's stopping them? And ultimately, I just came away with this impression that we were just trusting the moral compass of everyone in this community to do the right thing. And I wanted to know what those moral compasses looked like, and whether they were the same for people in the United States as they were for people in Argentina or in China or Iran. And those questions were not welcome in this community. And that made me even more of an outsider. So, on the one hand, like, sometimes it just takes the kid to walk into the room to ask that question, to be like, what are you guys talking about? And a lot of times I felt like that kid. And a lot of times I got treated like that kid. And I talk about that in the book, that a lot of times I was spoken to like the kid at the dinner table asking these questions, like, you'd be better off not asking that question, or the less you know, the better, or you'll only be putting yourself in danger if you continue on this path. And it took a lot of nerve to sort of just continue to ask the question. And I think that probably comes out in the book. But also, the reason it took me 7 years is because it was really intimidating to think about the ultimate reaction that would come from the technical information security community. I knew the Twitter blowback was going to be fierce. I knew there were people who were going to say, why do you think you could be the person to write this book about this subject matter? You don't know anything. You're not technical. You're not a cybersecurity expert. And females on Twitter and female journalists, it is a sad reality that we get far more blowback than our male colleagues do. I could be byline number 4 or 5 on a story of all men, and I am the only one who will hear about it on Twitter. So the dynamic is real, but it's exacerbated by so much of this sort of outsider perspective, and being a journalist, and just the subject matter being so technical and me being so non-technical. My husband jokes that I can't even get our remote control to work, but people just assume I have a coding background, and that is a hindrance a lot of times, but sometimes it's an asset, because I always have to ask people at the end of the interview, take everything you just told me and now tell it to me again as if I am your 9-year-old daughter, because that is where my comprehension is. And more importantly, that is where my reader's comprehension is. And if I can't translate what you are saying for that 9-year-old, then forget it. Then what is the point of this conversation? Because it's just going to go over everyone's heads. And so it was helpful to come into this space as someone with that 9-year-old understanding, and not be afraid to say, I don't know this space very well, so tell it to me again like I am 9 years old. And I think ultimately that benefits the reader, but it creates all kinds of problems in terms of my interactions with this community.
I imagine. And that's actually one thing we wanted to ask you about as well. So Espen, I'm not sure if you wanted to kind of bring that up about what the reaction has been.
Yeah, what the reaction has been. But just following up what Nicole just said, was it not in one of the conferences? I don't remember which, maybe Echo Party, but I don't think it was Echo Party, but some other hacking conference where they even insisted that you wear a glowing necklace so that identify
around my neck, yeah, like a dog collar, yeah.
Yeah,
that was at Infiltrate.
Infiltrate, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Dave Vitale made me wear a glow stick around my neck, and it was very
so
degrading.
Everybody knows that you're unbelievable. You're very brave. You're very brave to do that, and despite to go there and come to absolutely. And yeah, what happened afterwards? I mean, we keep talking about the things in the book, and there is much more that we want to learn about. I'm trying to learn in particular more about the Argentine ecosystem of the hackers and hacking. I had no idea before reading this book, just like I didn't know anything about Jim Gosler, but that space looks amazing, the way that you describe it. And afterwards, after I read, I searched more and, got into all those Discord channels and everything. It's just amazing. But before that, what has been the reaction like after the book was published from the same players, nation state or otherwise, in that zero-day markets, underground markets?
It is probably what you would expect, or what I expected, and probably why I would get writer's block every several months writing this book for 7 years. The mainstream press reaction has been incredible. I didn't know, I was driving, I didn't know that they were going to review it, and my phone started blowing up, and it was people telling me that my book was being reviewed by Jill Lepore in the New Yorker. That is so far beyond who I thought the audience for this book would be. So the mainstream reaction has been incredible, and I think it's really increased awareness. And I'm hearing from people like staffers for senators saying, whoa, I just read this. I made my boss read it. You will be hearing from us again soon. So that's great, because that is who I want to be reading this book. And I wrote this for, again, a lay audience. The reaction from the technical community has been mixed, and I'll get to the intelligence community. The reaction from the technical community has been mixed. Initially, all the people who knew I was writing this book, who disinvited me from hacking conferences, who made me wear a glow stick at the Infiltrate conference, hated it. They knew it was coming, and they knew that they would get mentioned, and they knew their business would be outed to some degree, and they hate it. And so people like Dave Vitale have been really critical of the book. Thomas Julian, who is known as Halvar Flake, wrote a really negative review of it and said, he said it's to be read like a novel. And he didn't like things like, when I say the NSA was hacking Google and Yahoo's data centers, he didn't like using the word hacking. He would have preferred that I used sniffing unencrypted web traffic, that kind of thing. And I knew that was coming, because anytime you try and dumb down the language in this space, which I do all the time at the New York Times, the technical experts hate it. And they'll always come at you, and they will nitpick. And that is what makes them such good engineers and hackers, because they are nitpicking at these systems and finding everything wrong with them all the time. So why wouldn't they do it when someone like me comes in and writes about it for a lay audience? So I knew that was coming. And the IC community, it's been really interesting. I didn't think I would hear from anyone, but I've started getting letters from people saying that they're going to incorporate the book into their trainings and into trainings at the Navy for some of their cyber warfare operations and trainees. And others have reached out and thanked me for writing about the vulnerability of these systems in a way that they could hand this book to their moms and their non-technical friends and say, this is what I've been dedicating my career to. And here you can finally see why I'm, bitter or grumpy or stressed out all the time. Here you go. And so I think it's been really helpful for them as a translation tool. I assumed they would hate it, but it turns out that actually they thought I did a nuanced job of explaining these issues and the trade-offs involved. And one of the frustrations in their community is that lawmakers really don't understand cybersecurity, and they don't really understand the trade-offs involved. And anytime we have a high-profile event or incident like SolarWinds, there's a lot of heated discussion about things like data breach notification laws, which could be important, but there's so much else that we need to address in addition to data breach notification rules. And so having this book, I think, has been a helpful tool for them. So, it's better. The reaction has been better than expected, and the negative reactions have been as expected. So would probably leave it there.
Absolutely, I think that I agree with you. The language you used in writing the book is absolutely delightful for some non-technical people. Had you gone that way, even assuming that you invested your time and energy and took a couple of courses on cybersecurity on Coursera or wherever to dig deeper into the technical side and turn your language into more of a technical one, your reach will be definitely much fewer than I assume currently is, because it reads really well. Really well.
Thank you.
I'm not saying that just to pray. I mean, you take the book and you read and you understand. And I was just talking to Scott, we're kind of biased because, there are things that we know, we don't even know we know. And when we read, we feel like but I have heard from many other people who looked at the book and read, my daughter read parts of it and they say, oh, this reads so well. I mean, you get it. You get it,
Thank you.
And one thing, the reason I said about the intelligence community and maybe some other players in the market, in that particular zero-day market, is I was talking, so the person who brought this book to my attention before it was published is actually, you might have heard of him, Pedram Amini, who is an Inquest and the person who put together the zero-day initiative and the tipping point. Yeah. So he was there and we're working with him to put together a course like intro to hacking, ethical hacking for undergrads. And we were working and he said that you'd interviewed many of the community members and that this book is coming up. This was back in January. And recently I wrote to him saying that I finished reading the book. It's great. It's wonderful. I really liked it. And he said, yes, I've read parts of it too. I like it too. But I hear that there are groups of people who are very agitated. So she's ruffled some feathers and things like that. He didn't go into details, so I didn't know if there were people who were upset that, you were showing the world what was going on.
Well, as you know, there are a lot of egos in this space and they can bruise pretty easily. And one of the things I've noticed among those who are sort of agitated, as you say, about the book, there are people I didn't speak to for the book, and I couldn't speak to everyone. And like I said, I really wanted to, the hardest part of writing in general is not what you're putting in, it's what you're leaving out. It's that part at the end where you have to leave stuff on the cutting room floor. And you can't overwhelm your reader, otherwise you lose them. And so that is why I chose to structure these chapters usually around one person, with the exception maybe at the end when I get to that Argentina hacking conference or to, the boomerang effect of some of these programs and recent attacks. I really wanted to structure them around one person. And so those people came back to me, even when, I'm not calling anyone a hero or really treating anyone as a hero, and I'm certainly not treating myself as a hero in the book. These are really nuanced, textured people. They're human. And so anytime you write about someone as if they're human, chances are they're not going to like everything that you wrote. But most of the people that I did write about came back and said, wow, thank you. Thank you for treating me this fairly. And the people who've been really upset are people like Thomas, who I did not interview for the book and felt like it was too US centric. He is European, and I think he has his own story to tell about where he is now. But people who I didn't interview were upset. And who else was upset? So when Thomas wrote that review, I sat on it for a day. It's never a nice experience to read when someone is critical of you. And I had to get a therapist during this book writing process because, it's just you in a Word doc for 7 years and your husband or spouse or child cannot be your sounding board for this kind of thing. So I got a therapist. So I called him and I was like, okay, someone wrote a really negative review and I'm going to read it to you word for word. And I want you to know, I want you to just listen and tell me what your thought is. So I read it. And then he said, 3 words, bruised male ego. Okay. So then he explained to me this whole thing. So I tweeted that, big mistake. I said, I just read a bruised male ego response to my book that called it too US centric and said it was sort of xenophobic to Europeans, which is ridiculous because I'm European, I'm Dutch. And, it's just, I was too defensive about it. And so I think that really had some blowback for me. And I learned my lesson that Twitter is a horrible place for any kind of response. And you shouldn't share your therapist notes someone who writes a critical review. So yeah, it did ruffle some feathers, but I think I knew that was going to happen. And like you said, if I wrote a book that everyone in the technical community said, this is the book, this is great, I would not, no one else would have read it.
No,
So,
no.
yeah.
No, and wouldn't have served. I mean, I understand from what you said at the beginning what your purpose goal was, to talk about the things that people didn't want to talk about. And many of these technical people honestly either know about this kind of thing, not in so many details that you expose, but either they know, or they can find if they want, they know what IRCs are, they know where to go to dig deeper into this if they wanted to. The point was to reach to the layman on the street who probably has no idea what 0 day even means. So that is achieved. The goal, the mission is accomplished, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's gripping. And I have to say, Nicole, like I thought I knew, a fair amount about Stuxnet, Olympic Games. And I just finished, that chapter a few days ago, and wow. I mean, not only is it written in a really accessible way, but both the detail that you're able to contribute without overwhelming, the reader, I found to be really a wonderful balancing act. And, it's something that I frankly struggle with sometimes as well. So,
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for saying that, because that was also probably beyond finding someone in the IC community to speak to these programs. That was the second most intimidating part of writing this book, was Stuxnet and Olympic Games, because Kim Zetter's book is incredible on Stuxnet. It is basically the Bible on that attack. And then David Sanger, who I work with all the time at the Times, he was the first to really break open what the decision-making process around Stuxnet was in the Bush administration and the Obama administration. So I had this question of, this is not original research that I'm doing on Stuxnet. It's been so well covered. It's going to be it's always hard to just summarize someone else's reporting. So the way I ended up tackling that was going to some of the players involved and saying, what are some of the things that weren't covered around that period of time? And so what they said was, they said people haven't really understood the level of the Israeli psyop that was going around meaning the Israeli pressure campaign on the US to hand over our bunker buster bombs. And they told me about those test flights that the Israelis were running from Tel Aviv to Greece, and that they knew that the distance was not coincidental. That was the exact distance from Tel Aviv to Natanz. And it was their way of saying, make a decision or we will bomb Natanz. And, it's so interesting how serendipitous some of our careers are. But in 2006, while that was happening, I was working for Ted Kennedy on Capitol Hill in his foreign policy office, and covering the 9/11 hearings and the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs, Foreign Relations that Joe Biden headed at the time. And I remember at that point, one of the things I did for Ted Kennedy every day was write him a memo for his drive home, where I would at the top, he wanted to know the number of Americans who had died the previous day in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so every day I would write that memo for him and give it to him on his drive home. And it always had that number. And during that period, the number of American soldiers coming home in caskets was reaching its peak. And so I intimately remember that period of time and how little appetite we would have had to engage or get into a third war with Iran in the Middle East. And so with that sort of in my personal memory, it was really interesting to talk to people who were at TAO and NSA at that period, who talked about, yes, every time there was a simulation run at the Pentagon, about what would happen if we handed Israel our bunker buster bombs. They all showed that it would drag us into World War III, whether we were just giving them the bombs or giving them the quiet okay. And that is why it was so critical to George W. in his second term that he get a third option. Mm-hmm. And I actually walked away with a totally different impression from researching this book in that period of time of George W. Bush. We think of him as like this cowboy, maybe a little dumb, bellicose guy who was taken advantage of maybe by Dick Cheney and some of the other players at the time. I walked away with a totally different impression than I had going into this book, which is, when people at NSA would go brief him, this didn't make it into the book, so it's the first time I'm sort of saying this, they said they would walk out of the White House And they would say, I don't know who that cowboy is. He plays on TV, but that's not the guy we just met with. He would ask really engaging technical questions about Stuxnet and PLCs and how to get into an air gap system. And turns out he's a fluent French speaker. And, he was really pushing for this third option, despite the pressure from the Dick Cheney quarters of that administration, and seemed to have had his own odyssey and his own journey from the person we knew at the beginning of the first George W. Bush administration to the person we knew who really pushed Stuxnet and Olympic Games along. And so, just fascinating to go back to that period in history, which is weird to even call it history because it really wasn't that long ago.
Certainly. Yeah, we're gonna have you back in 2038, was it, Nicole? When everything
when everything's declassified.
Well, I'll send a calendar invite. Don't worry.
No, you know who you're gonna have on for then is the people who were involved in the code, who have told me they are waiting for 2023, I think is the year where everything gets declassified. And they're like, and then I'm writing the definitive book on Stuxnet and it's going to put everyone to shame. Oh and I don't doubt it. And I say, okay, well, consider me as maybe as a potential ghostwriter. So you make sure you're not, going over everyone's heads, but.
Absolutely. And again, we'd love to hear from others. Sue, Alexandra, Joyce, Tony, anybody, Diane, anybody, please feel free to jump in, okay? At any point. So I'll give you a second. And
ask me anything.
Yeah, no, and I because I know there's a lot of wonderful people with lots of different backgrounds on the call. So jump in. But maybe while you're thinking, just one of the things we wanted to talk with you about, Nicole, and you mentioned this several times, both in the book itself and the epilogue at the end, is this kind of interesting balancing act, right? That has to get done with what to do with these vulnerabilities, right? And for the uninitiated, it's VEP, right? This vulnerability equities, process. And, it's really hard to make that fun and engaging. Again, you managed to do that, right? So again, kudos. But I'm wondering, how, you say a lot about this in the book, but just, how effective have you seen that been over the last, couple years? Especially, yeah. I know there were some tweaks during the Trump administration. NSA has a big role here in determining when these vulnerabilities get turned back over. Maybe, a fly on the wall for the Biden administration now. What do you think? I mean, how effective, not only here in the US, right, but as we try to convince other countries around the world to be more transparent with this process?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. It's so funny that you mentioned that, because when people would hear that I was writing a book about the 0-day market, they were like, no one's going to read this. The vulnerability equities process, VIP, is not that interesting. I'm like, are you kidding? They're basically sitting around a table determining how vulnerable or not vulnerable to leave us. And that is where the most tangible conversations are happening about the trade-off between our national security and our cybersecurity. So to me, it was always fascinating. And I always should pause here and say that, some people walk away from this book saying I'm too critical, perhaps, of the intelligence community and these markets. And one of the things I want to say is that the United States should get tremendous credit for having a VEP process. No one is sitting around a mahogany table in Tehran debating whether or not to turn over a Windows vulnerability or 0-day to Microsoft. So, let's just honor that. But one of the things you probably got this takeaway in reading the book is that even though we have a process, doesn't mean we actually have anything figured out. And the overwhelming consensus, even among those who led these conversations, in the Bush administration and then under Obama and under Trump, is this is more art than science. At least we have a process, but it's messy. And as Michael Daniel told me, who led these discussions under Obama, sometimes there is blood left on the table, that these conversations can get very heated. And when he left the administration, he told me he had several regrets about some of the decisions that were made. And when he didn't speak to it directly because he can't, but I'm assuming that one of the regrets that he would have had is keeping the 0-day exploit secret that we now know to be Eternal Blue that was hacked and dumped online and used in the NotPetya attack and used in WannaCry and continues to pop up in ransomware attacks on American towns and cities. And we don't know that much about VIP. We don't know that much about individual conversations, about individual exploits, but we now know a lot about Eternal Blue. We know about the destruction that was wrought by holding on to it and then getting hacked. We know, from my own reporting that, people at TAO knew that by holding on to that particular vulnerability in Microsoft Windows, they would be, quote, fishing with dynamite. That in the hands of an adversary or a cyber criminal, it could be deadly. They knew that, but they also knew that it was netting some of the best counterintelligence that they were getting. And over again, what they said to me was, Nicole, you don't understand the intelligence we were getting from that one zero-day exploit. It was never even seriously considered for turning over to Microsoft. I don't even know if it came up in the VIP discussions or how frequently it would have continued to be brought up over the 5 years that we held on to it. But just looking at the VIP process through the prism of Eternal Blue, we know that every criteria people like Rob Joyce and others have said they hold dear in that process, such as how widely used is this software? How destructive would it be in the hands of an adversary? How damaging to our relationship, our being the intelligence community's relationship with Silicon Valley would it be if it was known that we held on to this for this long? Those are the top 2 or 3 criteria for that process. And just looking at Eternal Blue, we should have turned it over a long time ago. This was Microsoft Windows. It was, clearly in the hands of an adversary, it would cause a lot of damage because it costs $10 billion in damage just from the NotPetya attack. It hit critical systems, and it was hugely damaging to Microsoft's relationship with government. So much so that Brad Smith has really been on a speaking tour to talk about how destructive that was for our global cybersecurity, and that it's time to perhaps engage in talk of a digital Geneva Convention, which is a whole nother topic we could get into. But so, that is, to me, when I started writing this book, NotPetya hadn't happened yet. We didn't know the shadow brokers were out there. And there I was in the middle of writing a book about what could the theoretical damage be from these programs? And whoa, I never expected that the NSA would actually get hacked and that 2 of our nation state adversaries would pick up their tools, their zero-day exploit, and bake it in to their own destructive operations. But, that happened. And we're still picking up the pieces. It's just so interesting. These companies like Merck and Mondelez still haven't recouped the hundreds of millions of dollars in losses from the NotPetya attack because their insurers invoked a very common but rarely used war exemption in their policies, which says if you are collateral damage for war, we don't have to pay out your damages. And that was war, according to the insurance company. So that's being litigated right now. And ordinarily, I don't think cyber insurance is that interesting, but it's fascinating, some of the legal reasoning that's being cited in those cases. So worth following.
Absolutely. No, thanks a lot. That's actually my next academic article is called War Games, and it's all about that very litigation.
Oh, cool. Okay, well, share it with me, please.
Oh yeah, no worries, totally. And we're getting some great questions. I thought, Brad, Joyce, let's turn to yours next before we keep coming back to Espen and I's laundry list here. So Brad, I'm not sure if you'd like to chime in, but you were asking about the legislative potential reforms that could be in reach that could potentially help with this kind of layered defense idea, as well as maybe the zero-day market. I'm not sure if you wanted to add any other detail, Brad, for Nicole.
I'm hoping Nicole will give us hope that there is some legislative possibility on the horizon that would be helpful. I'm a little bit mindful of the Economist article from, I think, about 2018, which was terrifying, saying maybe the only hope was lawyers and liability to force companies to work on some of these things a little bit earlier. And I'd rather put my faith in coders, but I'm just curious if Nicole has a perspective given her political experience as well, working for the center.
Yeah, great question. I my optimism around legislation actually addressing this is null at this point. Having seen, I have huge respect for John McCain, but it was really frustrating to be covering the fact that he was the one who led the efforts to water down and then ultimately kill those bills that would have mandated better cybersecurity standards for critical infrastructure operators. So I think we've come to a place where the only legislation, it's not even legislation, that has come down has been in the form of an executive order, first from Obama and then under Trump, that just identifies critical infrastructure and recommends best practices for those operators. But as we all know, most critical infrastructure, maybe we don't know, most critical infrastructure in the United States is still maintained by the private sector. And some of those companies are PG&E, which has the big budgets to build up their own mini intelligence agencies and the dollars to put in place sophisticated threat intelligence and intrusion detection systems and know the importance of keeping their software patched, et cetera. But many of them are these small municipal water treatment facilities, wastewater treatment facilities, who just do not have those resources and don't have a whole lot of incentive to spend on security. And I love that. And so what are we going to do? Well, I do think that there is an executive order in the works. It might get announced today that would mandate two-factor authentication in some cases. I don't know the specifics, but that's the rumor. And I know that the technical community kind of likes to poo-poo recommendations like two-factor authentication, but I actually, I think it could go a long way. I think, yes, of course, there are ways to bypass two-factor authentication, like there are ways to bypass everything, and it's not going to stop the SVR from getting into a critical system. But I think mandating two-factor authentication, particularly for critical infrastructure operators, would eliminate 60% or more of the threats that they face. And so I think of course we should mandate two-factor authentication. I think if we're not going to legislate these issues, if we're going to leave these decisions open to the market, then why don't we just accept that and look at how to change the market incentives? And I think Gary McGraw, who I talked to for recommendations for the epilogue of my book, where I make some recommendations, suggests tax credits for companies that subject themselves to real penetration tests, not compliance checklists, but real penetration tests that could verify that they are using multi-factor authentication and they are air gapping their most critical systems and they aren't using Windows XP, and they do have regular patching schedules in place. And why don't we give tax credits for those companies? But I think one of the most controversial things I've been saying, and I don't even know if I put it in the epilogue in the book, but after SolarWinds, I've really come around to this, is I do think it's time to talk about penalties and fines for companies that have zero serious internal commitment to cybersecurity. I think it's ridiculous that SolarWinds password to their software update mechanism was SolarWinds 123, and that they didn't have proper two-factor authentication in place. Of course, it would not have stopped the SVR, like I said, but that software was hijacked to get into our nuclear labs. SolarWinds software was hijacked to get into our nuclear labs, and the fact that it was as easy as a password spraying attack is ridiculous. So should we consider fines for that kind of level of security? But even before that, I think just any legislation or executive orders that would craft a bill of materials could be really helpful, because we still don't know what's in our network. And when SolarWinds happened, when I called up those victims at the government agencies, half of them didn't even know they were using SolarWinds, let alone that the code, their build code is built in Belarus and overseas. Not to say that foreign development coding is fundamentally more vulnerable. But shouldn't we know where our code is being built and tested and maintained and how it's being secured? And why don't we know that? And just starting there, I think, is a really good place. And so I've heard more talk of a bill of materials after SolarWinds, and I think that and mandating two-factor authentication would be a good start. But obviously, we have a long way to go. The problem is we're in 2021, and we've refused to put in place any kind of market incentives or penalties or legislation on this issue. And in Israel, the Israeli cyber defense sits on private companies' networks in a lot of cases to block and defend and monitor for attacks, and we are not willing to do that, and there's very little appetite for that kind of thing. So if that's the case, what are we going to do? And I think right now the most interesting discussions are happening about the fine print in real-time information threat sharing, and how to do that at scale in real time in a way that would actually be actionable. So I don't know how that's going to come out in terms of whether it will be mandatory or who the participants will be or what the threat sharing channels will look like or what information will get shared or how we're going to put privacy protections in place. But that is all probably where some of the conversations are headed. And at least we're having those conversations right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Nicole. There's 1,000 directions I want to take this. This is great. Thank you so much. Well, one of our Hacking for Defense teams, our student teams right now, is looking at the problem of real-time info, threat sharing. And of course, they were doing it right as SolarWinds was breaking. So yeah, very, very hot topic, as you say. Joyce, I thought that's a great question as well. I'm wondering, both maybe Nicole, you could speak a little bit about your writing process. I mean, as you said, such a well-researched book that took 7 years to compile. What was it like to work through that process in terms of compiling, all these facts and figures and interviews into this very coherent, whole here, as well as what's next, right? Because of course you can't rest on your laurels. I'm sure there's already something else in the works there.
Thank you for that question. And actually, you had asked it in a different way, maybe earlier, Scott, about how do you do this when your day job looks like mine? And I didn't want to write a book, but I felt at a certain point that I needed to, and for a number of reasons. One, many of my male competitors at other publications were writing books, and at my own were writing books, and I was finding myself in the footnotes for coverage, like my coverage of the Saudi Aramco attack and the Iranian attacks on banks and that kind of thing. And I thought, do I want to live in the footnotes of these other people's books, or do I want to tell my own story? And apart from the people who were on the ground in Saudi Arabia remediating that attack, I knew it better than anyone. And so I knew I had to write a book. I had that feeling, and I kept trying to squash it. And it's funny, I had been approached by publishers frequently particularly after Chinese hackers hacked the New York Times, and I broke that story to write a book. But the last thing I wanted to do after a long day of covering nonstop cyber attacks was go home at night and write a book about nonstop cyber attacks. And so I would go to these lunches and I'd be very polite and I would say, I'm just not ready yet. And then one day I got a message from Danielle Svetkov, who's an agent at Levine Greenberg Roston. And she asked me to dinner, and I Googled her and I saw that she was an agent for a lot of chefs at really hard to get into restaurants in San Francisco. So I thought, okay, well, maybe she'll take me to State Bird Provisions where I can never get a reservation and we'll have a nice dinner. And, it doesn't look like she's done any serious nonfiction beyond, she'd done James Nestor's book, Deep. James Nestor just wrote a great book called Breathe, which is terrific and I recommend. Anyway, so beyond James Nestor, she had never really represented serious nonfiction authors. But when I got to dinner, she made it abundantly clear that she was interested in pivoting to nonfiction. And she came with a dossier on me of all the stories I had written for the Times that she thought would make for a compelling chapter in a book, and characters, people I had quoted over the years that she thought might make for compelling characters. And she even came with chapter titles and possible book titles. And basically she left me no choice but to write a book. And it, like I said, had been something that had been nagging me for a long time. So the hard part was, how do you write a book? Who would be my donkey for this book? They always say, who's your donkey? Who is the character that can take the reader's hand and walk them all the way through to the end? And there was no one who could, I think, in this space, walk people through the Cold War and Project Gunman and the the intelligence community's transformation in the 90s and after 9/11, and the Argentina hacking scene, and blah, blah, blah. So I knew, unfortunately, that on some level, I was going to have to be the donkey, which meant I was going to have to be in the very uncomfortable and vulnerable position of using the word I and me in this book, which is something they beat out of you at the New York Times. So all of that is to say, it was an incredibly intimidating process, and it wasn't a pleasant one. I only enjoyed writing this book when I would be in interesting interviews with people like Jim Gosler, who I probably would have never spoken to had I not decided to write the book, or in the very late or early morning hours in the middle of the night, sitting where I am now in my sort of shed in our backyard, when you're in that flow of writing and you're undisturbed. But those moments only happen so seldomly and are so precious, and all of the conditions have to be right to get there. And so I wish I could tell you that I structured my life to write this book in the most efficient way possible, but unfortunately it was a disaster. My first publisher actually canceled on me because I missed the 9-month deadline. They thought I could write this in 9 months, and it ultimately took me 7 years. It was 7 years. So I got married, I had a kid, the kid had health problems, I had health problems, we moved several times, it was messy. And by the end, it just took sort of closing my computer at 4 p.m. every day after I'd filed a story, getting some coffee, saying hello to my child and my husband, having dinner with them, no alcohol, unfortunately, and then coming back to my writer's shed and working from 8 p.m. until 3:30 a.m. in the morning, undisturbed, because that was the only time that my phone wasn't buzzing or my Slack wasn't going off and my notifications were down. And that's how I did it. And sometimes I would have to escape to my family's cabin in the woods, which I talk about a little bit in the book, or at least in my bio, where I just had to get away from it, and I had to be somewhere where I felt safe, because sometimes I'd be covering what TAO was doing, or what some of these zero-day brokers were selling to, or the vulnerability of the Internet of Things. And the safest place to write those, I felt, was at a cabin in the woods where I don't have an Alexa or Nest or baby monitor buzzing all the time. So that's kind of the messy version.
It's the reality. and we're all better for it. So thank you. Nicole. And Joyce, you didn't have a follow-up there, I don't think, right? That was okay. Just wanted to make sure. Sue, sorry, I just saw your question there. I'm not sure if you wanted to expand on that at all, but you were asking about, of course, the kind of the paranoia inevitably involved, right? You mentioned your TV earlier. Wait, if it's a smart TV or not, feel free to reflect. Or Sue, if you have any other thoughts you'd like to share for Nicole before she chimes in, feel free.
I'm just curious how you use tech or don't use tech yourself. And I imagine you were somewhat paranoid throughout the whole process, including things like Alexa, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, things like that. What your thoughts might be?
Yeah, I am such I'm just scared, I'm just scared of cryptocurrency because I've covered so many cryptocurrency exchange hacks. I was telling my sister-in-law this because she's a big Bitcoin enthusiast, and she was telling me all the things she does to keep her Bitcoin wallet secure, and sort of reassured me, but I just won't play in that space knowing everything I know. I still don't have an Alexa or a Google Home. It just seems like you're asking for it. On some level, I am a nation state target. I would be naive to assume I'm not. I had that front row seat to the Chinese attack on the New York Times, and they were after David Barbossa's sources, and they got into our computers and our inboxes. And I've covered the NSO group Pegasus spyware campaigns by governments on journalists and nutritionists even, and anyone that ruffles their feathers. And so I have to act like I am a nation state target, which means not plugging in things that I don't need to really use in my day-to-day life, like Alexa or Google Home. Even getting a Nest just for my thermostat seemed terrifying. So I don't have a Nest, but I've just noticed that you can't get away from it. You might not have a Nest, but you have a GPS enabled car, and your phone provides plenty of information to a would-be spy or cyber criminal or someone who's interested in learning what you're about to publicize about them in your book. And I have had moments of extreme paranoia. When I was covering the Chinese attack on the New York Times, I had this moment. I was living by myself, and I came home at night, and my cable box in my bedroom started making really weird noises one night, in the middle of that assignment. And I got up in the middle of the night and I ripped it out of the wall. And I said something like, F you, Chinese hackers or something. And in the morning, with that golden morning light on my cable box that I'd ripped out of the wall in the middle of the night, it just looked like, oh my God, I have become a tinfoil hat person. What is wrong with me? I cannot live my life like this. I cannot become one of these people. So that was a wake-up call. And I just sort of decided at that moment that, of course, I'm never going to feel perfectly secure, but I will do the best I can. And for me, doing the best I can is not plugging in an Alexa and using pen and paper when I go meet a sensitive source. And, I even have one source, at least before the pandemic, where we would meet once every month on the first, let's just say Tuesday of the month at the same restaurant in San Francisco. And we would never bring our devices, and I would just bring pen and paper, and I would walk there from my office so that I wasn't getting tracked through a Uber or a GPS in my car. And that is the only time I would ever speak with them. And we would never email, and we would never discuss these meetings in any other context. And that is how I protected my sources. And it was very old school, but that is the only way I know to be truly secure, or at least as secure as you can be. And I talk about in the book, actually, after I wrote that story and those series of stories about Chinese cyber espionage, my mentor took me out to lunch, Phil Taubman. He was the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times during the Cold War. And he asked me, are you nervous? Are you scared? And I giggled. I don't even know. I just had like a nervous giggle. And he said, well, let me tell you that when I was doing this coverage for the Times, the KGB would follow me. And as I was dropping my kids off at preschool in Moscow, and they would make a really loud show of it, and they would let me know that we were being followed. And we would come home sometimes, and there would be dirty liquor glasses in the sink, but nothing ever happened to me or my family, because in some way, when you work for the New York Times, you have a little bit of an invisible armor around you that if something were to happen, it would be an international incident. So he said, I want you to take comfort in that on some level, and to also assume that you are being watched, and to know that sometimes people will make a loud show of it, but that ultimately, if something were to happen, it would be an international incident. And I took comfort in those words, but things changed under Trump, with Jamal Khashoggi, and there being little repercussion, if any, for what happened to him. And also, Trump singled me and David Sanger out for treason in a tweet one day. And to the New York Times eternal credit, they didn't take that lightly. And Arthur Sulzberger, our publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, wrote an op-ed for the Journal about it. And he told the story, and the story that just blew my mind, about how after one of our colleagues had written this story for the New York Times Magazine about an Italian graduate student who'd been murdered by Egyptian security forces and dumped on the side of the highway because they wrongly assumed him to be a spy. We got a call at the New York Times from someone at the US Embassy in Cairo that said, he is about to get arrested and you need to get him out of the country. But no one at the US Embassy is planning on facilitating that. But we also know that he is a dual citizen, a dual Irish citizen. So we suggest you call the Irish Embassy immediately and get him out of the country. And we made a call to the embassy, the US Embassy, and they were polite, but they said, yeah, we don't plan on doing anything about this. So whatever happened, US diplomats were perfectly okay letting an American New York Times journalist get picked up by Egyptian authorities that, we had just written this hugely critical story about. And it was ultimately Ireland that got him out. And that just blew my mind. That would have never happened, I think, under previous administrations. But once you start calling journalists the enemy of the people, you really give carte blanche to these other governments to treat us like the enemy of the people. And we don't have the same free press and First Amendment protections in those countries that we do here. So anyways, that is a long version of just saying that by the end of this book writing process, one of the most terrifying things was that I really felt like the invisible armor had disappeared. And I knew that this book was going to piss off, officials in Abu Dhabi, but also in Washington. And I thought it was going to come out last September ahead of the election. So I didn't know, what administration would be in office by the time this book came out. And, it was just something that, in addition to all the other things I've enumerated, was hanging over my head. But yeah, fortunately, I haven't been singled out for treason since.
It's a win. Thank you so much, Nicole and Sue. And unfortunately, I know we're running very short on time, but Espen, I know there's also a number of questions that you were hoping to get to as well. So maybe you'd like to pose a follow-up, maybe about the Argentina question you kind of brought up. Oh, I think you might still be on mute. I'm sorry.
Yes, I have to unmute first. I was really, I found it very exciting. Actually, I have two questions. One is very easy. I think probably the answer is no to that. But did you finally manage to find who was behind the iPhone hack, San Bernardino iPhone hack for FBI?
No, I got as far as I said I got in the book, where
And
I was told,
I see.
I was told, as that it wasn't Celebrite, the Israeli firm that kept trying to take credit for it, which was bizarre. It wasn't Celebrite, but it was an American hacker that was on the Appalachian Trail. And honestly, as a writer, that is probably as poetic as it gets. So I was content to stop there. But since the book has published, I've had outreach from people who say, I think I know who this is. So maybe you'll see that story coming.
Maybe at some point it will come out.
Yeah.
And if you can tell us a little bit more about the experience in Argentina. I mean, how do you, from where places you went? I think that you went to one of those, you mentioned that you were in the line and there were lots of people around. You met Gerardo and others,
Yeah. It just, I really was hung up on this idea of moral compass, and hearing that there was an entire exploit development industry in Argentina. I really wanted to know what that compass looked like in Argentina. And it was just fascinating to see that there was such a culture around exploit development, and to see sort of where it came from, and that it came from a combination of a strong technical science, math education, and export restrictions on the kind of technology that they could get and access. And it blew my mind that you couldn't even buy an iPhone, in Argentina when I was there in 2015, 2016. And that they didn't have Amazon Prime, and it just, all the things we take for granted on our iPhones, they had to hack to get access to those same things. And so it made sense that they would develop a strong hacking culture, and that they would become, as they put it, the India of exploit development, that they would become sort of the world's manufacturing hub for 0-day exploits. And you could see, just because, I had to get cash at the Cueva, and you could see the inflation was such a huge problem, you could see why someone would choose to work on 0-day exploits and sell them to governments so that they wouldn't have to pay taxes on it and deal with inflation. And that, in Argentina, the dollar goes very far, and you can really live a very wonderful, luxurious life in Palermo, with a house in the country and an infinity pool, selling 0-day exploits to governments. But then, like I said, the book was a learning journey. And the big lesson I took away from my time in Argentina was, one, that, the US doesn't control the exploit market. We might be the most sophisticated, but there is a market, and it is meeting demand elsewhere. And two, that my questions around the moral compass were very US centric, and that I was coming from a very naive American perspective. And that in Argentina, I learned so much about their history for the book research, but the fact that, we had looked the other way during their dirty wars, when they were literally drugging young men and dropping them out of planes into rivers, and, just walking around Buenos Aires and seeing those every Thursday, I think it was Thursday, women's marches of grieving mothers and grandmothers who lost their sons to those wars. I could see firsthand that they don't think of the United States as a good Western government. They think of us as a facilitator of torture and murder. And at the time I was there, they were in the middle of this very heated election. And Christina Kirchner had even said on television right before I got there, if something should happen to me, don't look to the Middle East, look north. She was saying, basically insinuating the United States would plan to assassinate her. And so it was just fascinating to go there and see those dynamics firsthand, and then to sit down with Ivan Arce, who I asked the dumb question to, which is, will these hackers only sell to good Western governments? And I phrased it that stupidly. And like I said in the book, I just sort of cowered as soon as the words dribbled out of my mouth, because I knew how dumb it sounded and how American and naive it sounded. And he says, Nicole, last time I checked, the country that bombed another country into oblivion wasn't Iran or China. So we don't think of you as a good Western government. We'll sell to whoever brings us the biggest bag of cash. And you're pretty naive for thinking otherwise. And so that was just that mind-blowing epiphany moment where I realized that this whole time I had been chasing these questions around everyone's moral compass, and then realizing that I was coming at that from a very, US centric view. And again, the book was my learning journey. So by the end, I come out of it in a different place. But one of the hard things I will say, coming back to your earlier question about criticisms and reception, was in that critical review from Thomas, he said, the book was that was one of his favorite parts of the book, is when Ivan sort of corrected me and said, good Western governments, which is easy. And that before that, I was sort of coming at it in a way too US centric way. But, that is an easy criticism, because at the beginning of the book, I'm purposely asking the questions in really simplistic ways. And this book is my learning journey. And by the end, I do realize that, these markets and these capabilities have drifted so far beyond the United States control. And we are not always seen as the good guys, and especially not now, after, putting children in cages at the border, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and even, it was really interesting, even interviewing people at VRL, an American, cyber arms factory or spyware development factory, where even they, former NSA hackers, were saying over the past few years that they started to have questions about their biggest customer, US intelligence agencies, and whether they were arming the wrong people, and starting to have doubts about things that assumptions that they had taken for granted for a long time. So, we're human, and those are the questions that I just find fascinating, and from all perspectives, from national security to ethics to vulnerability and just American exceptionalism. So.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's indeed fascinating. That part in particular, it was really interesting to see that dynamics. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it has shifted away from any potential near future American control, or even Western control.
Yeah. There were some people who said that even by citing this capabilities gap, that I was being too US centric. And the reason I focused on the capabilities gap, actually, I don't think I say this, sorry, someone just broke through my do not disturb. I don't think I say this outright in the book, but one of the things I saw in the Snowden trove of documents that I was given firsthand access to, and I discuss at the beginning of the book, was a classified national intelligence estimate from 2009. And on one page, they outlined where they saw our adversaries in terms of their capabilities. And Russia was on top just for the sophistication, but we saw China as the more imminent threat because they were so prolific at stealing American intellectual property at that period, though not as sophisticated as Russia. And then there was this big gap. And then there was Iran and North Korea, who in 2009, the intelligence community determined had the intent to use cyber means to cause destruction and presented a real threat, but lacked the capabilities. And so I could read, there was a very clear capabilities gap that we assumed to be there that year in 2009. And then being at the New York Times and covering that Saudi Aramco attack in particular, what they did with rudimentary code was wipe out data and replace it with an image of a burning American flag. And when I interviewed US intelligence officials about that attack, they all said some variation of the same thing, which was, we didn't expect them to, we underestimated how quickly they would develop the capabilities to do us harm. We also we were thinking about it in the wrong way. We were thinking about the fact that they couldn't pull off a Stuxnet. Well, what we didn't realize is that they didn't need 7 zero-day exploits in Siemens and Microsoft Word to cause so much damage. And the fact that they were able to go from 2009, when they had very little cyber capabilities, and anything they had, they were using to just spy on their own people, to a place where they were hacking the world's richest oil company in just a span of 2-3 years, freaked out American officials. And now we're in a different place in terms of our low-lying cyber conflict in Iran because of the Iran nuclear deal, and then it getting canceled and now potentially being back on. But Iran is one of the most prolific adversaries we now face in the cyber domain, which to me is stunning, given all of the coverage and time and energy I spent covering Chinese cyber espionage. The fact that Iran has sort of caught up to that frequency level is it just blows my mind all the time.
Yeah. And now with one of the largest cyber armies.
Yeah, no, indeed.
Yes. I mean, according to them, I don't know, but why not? Why if they're never going to match us militarily?
No. So they see that as
right.
Because this at least has a potential to do some real damage, whereas otherwise, you can you imagine taking guns and doing anything? No, not why. There's no way.
Yeah.
So,
And the other thing about that, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, and then I know we probably have to close, but is that they have the luxury of conscription. They can tell people, you are going to work for us. You're going to do this. We know you have these skills. We don't have that luxury here. And like we've discussed, people who do have those skills in the United States have plenty of job opportunities at Google and Microsoft and FireEye and places that will pay them a lot more money than they could get in government. And they don't want to necessarily go work at Homeland Security. They want to go work at NSA and Cyber Command. And so we have a real talent shortage actually in this area that they do not. So when they say we have the 5th biggest cyber army in the world, I sort of believe them because it's not like they have a recruiting issue. They can just force anyone to go
Yes.
work on those
Yes.
programs. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely they can. Yeah.
On that uplifting note. But, Nicole, this has been so fantastic. We can't
Thank you. This was so fun.
Yes, out of your very busy schedule. And again, if you haven't already picked it up, you can't really see. There we are. It's an excellent read. We are
Thank you. Thanks,
you so
everyone.
That's right.
These
Thank you
questions
so
were
much.
terrific. And
No, they sure
yeah,
were. Thanks,
I
everyone,
loved it.
for joining.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you
Have
so
a great
much.
weekend, Nicole. Thanks again.
Okay.
Bye.
My next book is going to be a cookbook, by the way. So
All right,
I don't know if I'll see you for that one,
I
but
love that
we
as
do
well.
cook too. No, we love cooking too.
okay. IoT
All right, take
cooking.
care. Bye. Bye.
All right.
Oh, I
Thanks,
love it.
guys.
Bye.
Thanks again, Nicole.
Bye.